Once upon a time, back in the middle of the 1800s, a bunch of curious folks got together in France. They wanted to figure out what happens after we die. Think of them like ghost detectives. They called themselves the bold spirit testers. Yeah, I know. It's a weird name, but it matters. These brave investigators were like magnets for spirits. Their meetings were a mix of a circus and a science lab. They tried talking to spirits using spinning tables, strange knocks, and even pens that wrote messages from the other side. But in the world of ghost stuff, not everything is serious. There were a lot of fakers trying to trick people with cheap tricks. They say they caught one guy using a balloon filled with gas to pretend to be a ghost. It's like trying to say a party balloon is a message from the dead. Despite the mess-ups, lots of people around the world got into spiritualism. It inspired writers, artists, and even scientists to think about what we can't understand about the universe. Have you ever had any spooky ghost encounters? The idea that we live more than one life has been around for ages. Ancient Egyptians and folks in the East believed in it. Dolores Cannon, an expert in hypnotherapy, was a big deal in exploring this. She had a fresh way of looking into past lives and the afterlife. While Egyptians had rituals, Cannon looked into people's minds to find out about the soul's journey. With her hypnosis tricks, she showed us stories from the past that felt real. It's like a cosmic adventure, like Star Wars, but from a holy book. Her teachings ask us to think about life after death in a totally new way. What if one life is hard enough, let alone many? Back in ancient times, Egyptians had special rituals to help them reach the afterlife. They thought if they did certain things, they'd be okay in the next life. Dolores Cannon, though, made us think harder about what happens after we die. She got us to be more creative and open-minded. In old India, people believed in something called reincarnation. This means living many lives, each one affected by what you did before. It's like a spiritual journey to get better and cleaner. Egyptians saw death as a doorway to another life. They believed your spirit kept going after your body died. To make sure you made it to the next life, they did things like mummification. They thought if your spirit was pure, you'd go to a good place. But if you had too much bad stuff weighing you down, your spirit might be destroyed. Even though Egyptians didn't talk much about coming back in another body, some experts think they kinda believed in it. They wrote about trials your spirit had to face after death. Like in the Book of the Dead, it's like a cycle of starting over spiritually. Between Death and Life by Cannon talks all about life after death and being reborn. Should someone with a serious illness like cancer read it? With all due respect, yes. In the book, she tells stories from her therapy sessions, where people talk about what happens between lives. She makes us think about what we believe about dying and what comes next. Her kind way of talking helps us feel better about what happens when we move from one life to another. It's a really interesting book. It makes us think about what happens after we die and keeps us wondering about life after death. Anyone who wants to know more about how our minds work would find it fascinating. You can find a link to get your own copy in the comments below. In ancient Egypt, they didn't talk much about coming back in a new body. Pharaohs were more focused on making sure they had a good afterlife. They built big tombs and temples to help them move on. Even though people saw pharaohs as gods, there's no proof they thought about coming back after death. In ancient Greece, though, some smart people like Pythagoras and Plato thought a lot about coming back after death. They believed our souls are mortal and learn from each life we live. It's like going to school for your soul. It's surprising how much suffering there is. Yet these clever folks from the past worried about having money and food. I'm not saying everyone in ancient Greece believed in coming back to life, but some smart thinkers talked about it. Take Pythagoras, for example. He lived a long time ago and said our souls move from one body to another after we die. Plato, another famous Greek thinker, also talked about it. In one of his stories, a soldier named comes back from the dead to tell what he saw in the afterlife. Not everyone in ancient Greece believed in reincarnation, but these discussions made people think about what happens after we die. These ideas have influenced how we think in the Western world for a long time. But even with all this thinking, bad things like slavery and mistreating women still happened. It's impressive how people thought so deeply but still did wrong things. If you're into reading, I've got some recommendations for you. Pyramid texts and sarcophagus texts. These are old texts from Egypt that tell us about their beliefs in the afterlife and how to get there safely. The Odyssey by Homer. This story doesn't talk about coming back to life directly, but it has lots of cool stuff about what happens after we die. In Greek stories, a guy named Odysseus meets lots of dead people, like his ancestors and famous folks. It gives us a peek into what Greeks thought about life after death. Metamorphoses by Ovid, even though it's Roman, is full of Greek myths. Ovid talks about life, death, and change, showing us how people can change spiritually. The Book of the Dead from Egypt is really famous. It's like a guidebook for dead people, with spells and songs to help them get to the afterlife. It tells how to beat the bad stuff in the underworld and live forever with the gods. The Book of Caves is another Egyptian text. It talks about the sun's journey at night through the underworld. It shows the dead person as a hero facing dangers and becoming immortal. But hey, I'm not a rich guy like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, so I'll stick to work. But here's a question: if working is all it takes, why didn't black people during slavery times just work more? Once upon a time, in the middle of the 1800s, a bunch of curious folks got together in France to explore what happens after we die. They were like detectives from the afterlife, trying to solve mysteries about what comes next. Let's call them the brave soul seekers. They were like magnets, pulling spirits towards them, and their meetings were a mix of circus and science lab. They tried to talk to spirits using spinning tables, strange knocks, and even pens that wrote messages from the dead. But not everything was serious in the world of spirits. There were also tricksters trying to fool people with cheap tricks, like using balloons to fake ghostly appearances. Despite all this, spiritualism became really popular, inspiring writers, artists, and scientists to think about the universe in new ways. Have you ever had a scary ghost experience yourself? The idea of coming back to life has been around for ages, from ancient Egypt to Eastern beliefs like Hinduism and Buddhism. They believe we live many lives, shaped by what we did before. Even the ancient Egyptians had their own way of preparing for the afterlife, with rituals like mummification. Then there's Dolores Cannon, who wasn't afraid to ask big questions about life and death. She used hypnosis to explore past lives and the soul's journey. Her stories take us on an amazing adventure through different times and places, making us think about life in a whole new way. Now, let's talk about how different cultures see God. It's like describing the taste of rainbows, or the sound of silence that can be confusing, right? But according to spiritualism, God is like the big boss of the universe, watching over everything. He's loving but also fair, like a strict parent who still gives you hugs. And what about reincarnation? Some scientists have studied cases where kids remember things from past lives, which raises interesting questions about the mind and consciousness. It's still a mystery, but it makes you wonder who you might have been in another life. Have you ever wondered if your soul lives forever and goes through many lives? Reincarnation is a belief often linked to spiritual and religious ideas, but even science has some interesting things to say about it, though it's hard to prove. Some researchers have looked into cases where people remember past lives. One famous example is psychiatrist Ian Stevenson, who studied kids who claimed to remember things from before they were born. These kids talked about real events and people they couldn't have known about otherwise. These cases don't prove reincarnation for sure, but they make us think. How could these kids know about things from before they were born? Some scientists also study whether our genes might carry memories from our ancestors, which could affect how we think and act. So, even though we can't say for sure, the idea of reincarnation is still a big mystery that goes beyond what we know in science. Some things seem to hint that reincarnation might be real, but people still argue and wonder about it a lot. Hey, if you had a past life, who do you think you were? I hope I wasn't Hitler. If this journey has made you feel something special, don't keep it to yourself. Click that like button, subscribe to stay updated, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Share a moment when you felt like one of the special people in your own life. Your story could be the light that helps someone else through their tough times. Thanks for all the support, it means a lot. Have a great day.